Hello there, my little victims. Welcome to Bedtime Murder Stories. Are you all alone, tucked into bed with your lights turned off? Yes. Then let's begin with tonight's bedtime story. Wes Craven's 1996 blockbuster Scream redefined the horror genre. The movie's plot of a masked murderer taunting his victims through phone calls and terrorizing an entire town may seem the stuff of Hollywood fiction. But 6 years before the fictional town of Woodsboro faced a serial killer, the inspiration for Ghostface brought a real town to its knees. Now let's reveal the true story behind Scream. The panic and chaos that reigned during a 5-day killing spree by the so-called Gainesville Ripper. The elements of the Gainesville River case. Obviously, in the film, the sense of paranoia. The sense of who did it. Is it my boyfriend? Is it someone I know? Who is this killer? Set in the fictional college town of Woodsboro, the movie's villain is a masked serial killer called Ghostface, who targets and taunts his victims before brutally murdering them. With Ghostface, Craven created one of the most instantly recognizable and iconic villains in movie history. But unlike his previous horror characters, this movie maniac was inspired by a real serial killer, the Gainesville Ripper. On March 9, 1994, American network ABC broadcast a news special featuring a series of gruesome murders that took place 4 years earlier in the city of Gainesville, Florida. Watching the report that night was a young screenwriter, Kevin Williamson. He was sitting in a house on his own. On the television was playing a program about the Gainesville Ripper. He became somewhat alarmed being in a large, kind of creaking house on his own. He also noticed that one of the windows was open, and he hadn't noticed that before, and wondered if there was someone in there with him. This put him in the kind of mood to write a horror story, and he did. He wrote an 18-page treatment for what would later become Scream. Williamson's screenplay combined elements of the real-life horror that gripped the city of Gainesville with a postmodern take on the horror genre. Scream isn't a recreation. It isn't a true story in that sense, but elements are very similar, the key one being that the victims, both in the real-life case and in the film, are young people in Gainesville. On August 20th, 1990, the university town of Gainesville was ranked as the 13th best city in the United States by Money magazine. Before the end of the month, Gainesville was in chaos, and the most expensive manhunt in Florida's history was underway. Like the movie Scream, the first murders that came to light were the brutal slayings of 2 young students. On that fateful night, Ronald DuPont Jr., a journalist, was driving around when the call went out for those first student murders. At the time of the murders, Ronald DuPont Jr. was 19 years old. He was a student by day, but worked nights for the Gainesville Sun. What he would do is get in a car, take a walkie-talkie, listen to the police scanner, and just drive around. On Sunday, August 26, 1990, at 3:30 p.m., Ron was on his way home when he picked up a radio transmission from a police officer requesting backup. By the time Ron arrived on the scene, police cruisers had filled the parking lot of the Williamsburg complex and the area was sealed off. When Ron pulled up, he knew the police officers and knew the deputies. They stopped him from going any further. Ron stated he was not used to being told he couldn't go past the tape. They said, "You just gotta stay behind the tape." Inside apartment 113 of the Williamsburg complex was a horrific scene. Housemates Sonia Larson and Christina Powell, both age 17, had been brutally stabbed and mutilated. One of the police officers, whom Ron knew really well, walked around to the back of the building and started throwing up. Len Register, the state attorney at the time of the murders, got a call that there were 2 girls who had been discovered murdered at one of the apartment complexes in Gainesville. Len quickly went to the scene. As state attorney, he played a key role in the investigation and discovered the 2 girls who had been murdered in such a brutal way. It was really such a shocking event. Sonia Larson's body was upstairs. She'd been murdered in her sleep in what the medical examiner described as a blitz attack. Christina Powell's body was lying downstairs by the living room sofa, being she was positioned on the floor, almost on display without any clothes. Both Sonia Larson's and Christina Powell's bodies had been posed for shock value. In Scream, Ghostface's first female victim is found disemboweled and hanging from a tree. The Gainesville killer had also deliberately choreographed a scene of horror. Unlike his movie counterpart, the real killer had taken the time to clean the crime scene in an attempt to cover his tracks. As with the movie, the brutal murder of 2 students was just the beginning of a killing spree that would bring an entire town to its knees. Wes Craven added humor and gory thrills to entertain his audience. The true story on which his slasher movie was based simply terrified everyone involved. Reality is a lot different from what the screen depicts. The level of fear now on campus and in the community was palpable. Linda Gray was the University of Florida's official spokesperson at the time of the murders. As Director of News and Public Affairs, it was her job to liaise with the media. 2 young women were found. The university was reeling with that and knew it would be a statewide story. As Linda prepared a statement to the press about the first 2 murders, news came through that a 3rd victim had been discovered. 18-year-old student Krista Hoyt worked the night shift as a clerk at the sheriff's office to pay for her studies. When she failed to show up for work or answer her phone, officers were sent to her apartment. Just 9 hours after the discovery of the first 2 victims, they uncovered a scene more gruesome than any in Scream movie. Krista had not only been murdered, she had been decapitated. The crime scene itself was so brutal with the removal of her head, and that was quite alarming. The shock value was extremely high for the people who were personally present and who knew her. Like the first 2 murders, the killer had cleaned the scene in an attempt to remove any evidence that would identify him. The police had no witnesses, no suspect, and no murder weapon. In the movie, the murderer taunts his female targets, calling his victims before killing them. The on-screen detectives trace phone records to track the perpetrator down. In the real story, there was no evidence that the victims had any prior contact with their killer. So Gainesville police turned to forensic science to provide the clues they desperately needed. A weapon that may be used from a knife to a hammer to a gunshot. They certainly create a different type of bloodstain pattern. And from the patterns, you can associate that with specific incidences that may have occurred. If a person is bleeding, they walk across the room, they're going to leave a blood-stained trail in the direction that they're going. If it is a bludgeoning, there will be spatter that is created whenever the instrument impacts with the wet blood source. So in essence, it's telling a story of what has occurred in order to produce the blood stains as we see them. The blood patterns at the first crime scene identified the murderer's weapon of choice. Just like Ghostface, the killer had used a large knife. The second Gainesville crime scene revealed something even more chilling. When the heart stops pumping, gravity causes blood to sink to the lowest point in the body. This is known as lividity. If the body has been on the back a sufficient long enough period of time, then the lividity will start becoming fixed. What is meant by that is that if you roll the body and transport it, the blood that has settled down to the lowest part of the body will stay to where you're able to recognize that it has settled there. Maximum lividity takes at least 6 hours to occur. Krista Hoyt's body was found sitting upright, but her blood had pooled on her back. In order for that to have occurred, she would have had to have been lying on her back in order for gravity to pull the blood down and then for it to become fixed. This meant she had been killed then moved several hours later. It seemed the killer had spent some time at the crime scene. Christine had been raped. She had been butchered like an animal. Then she was decapitated. The killer put Christine's head on a shelf. Like the movie Scream, just hours after the discovery of the first crime scene, news of the murders went public. The news sent a shockwave through the community. And of course, what leaked out was far more dramatic than what happened. And what happened was really dramatic. What leaked out was tales of cannibalism and worse. In the movie following the student murders, the high school is shut down and a citywide curfew is put in place. Although Gainesville didn't establish a curfew, the University of Florida did give students the option of returning home. A lot of parents shot up there, grabbed their kids, and got them out. Some areas of town, for lack of a better term, became ghost towns. For those who stayed in Gainesville, the fear the killer would strike again began to escalate. People stopped jogging at night. People were afraid to go to the movies at night, arming themselves with kitchen knives. Almost everybody had pepper spray. You couldn't buy a gun at a pawn shop anywhere from Lake City to Ocala. They were ordering small tasers. Everybody had a gun at their house. Investigators formed a combined task force. It included top crime scene technicians, police investigators, and 10 of the leading criminal behavioral specialists from the FBI. In the movie Scream, the investigation remained within the confines of a small county police department. In the real story, 6 years earlier, Gainesville was flooded with local, state, and national law enforcement. More than 150 officers patrolled the streets of Gainesville. There were SWAT teams, dog units, and a Night Stalker helicopter scoured the intensive woodland areas surrounding the city. Florida's largest manhunt had begun. One of their objectives was to saturate the Gainesville area, where uniformed law enforcement and marked patrol cars as much as possible, in hopes of keeping the killer from feeling free to get out and move about and strike again. Just 3 days after the discovery of the first crime scene, they discovered 2 more bodies. The bodies of a young woman and her boyfriend were found, which raises the death toll to 5 in just 3 days. The victims were Tracy Paulus and Manuel Tobau, both 23 years old. They had been friends since high school and shared a 2-bedroom ground-floor apartment 3 kilometers away from the first murder scene. The level of fear had now escalated. Tracy Paulus had been raped and killed, while Manuel Tobau had been stabbed 37 times in the chest. It became clear that not even Gainesville's male population was safe with the discovery of Manny and Tracy Paulus, which confirmed their worst fears. A serial killer was at work in Gainesville. The gruesome chain of events, which went on to inspire a horror blockbuster, was far from over. Although the movie carries the hallmarks of a murder mystery, it lacks a crucial element of a real murder investigation: forensic science. They had 3 different agencies involved, and a very upset community and student population. Now retired, Steve Platt grew up in Gainesville. He was also the bureau chief of forensic science. He led the scientific investigation of the student murders in 1990. Over the course of the investigation, there were literally thousands of exhibits of evidence submitted to the laboratory. Everything from possible weapons, knives that could have been involved. There were numerous blood samples collected by the homicide task force. Imagine the cost of reviewing the evidence from all 3 crime scenes. Steve Platt and his team of forensic investigators soon established that the murders were the work of the same man. With the forced entry, the marks on each of the doors revealed the same method of entry: sticky residue from duct tape used to bind and gag. The victims were found at each location. The removal of the victim's clothing had a distinct and repetitive method, and with each crime, the killer had used detergent to clean the scene in an attempt to cover his tracks before leaving. Like the movie Scream, the lack of physical evidence left by the murderer paralyzed the investigation. They were no closer to identifying a suspect until Steve Platt made a startling discovery. He was looking through photographs of all of the crime scenes and trying to identify in those photographs items of evidence that might give them a real clue. There was a paper towel on a kitchen countertop, and that paper towel had neat semen on it. It was the crucial piece of evidence. Steve Platt was looking for an uncontaminated source of the criminal's DNA. The pressure was now on to find the killer. The DNA results would take weeks to come through, and with a sadistic killer still on the loose, fear within the Gainesville community began to reach fever pitch. Rumors were rife, something that was mirrored in Scream. The Gainesville Task Force Rumor Control Hotline went into overdrive. They were inundated with tips. If I think it's this person, or I think it's that, or I heard this, or I heard that, then rumors started floating. Even rumors, it was a cop. Everybody became suspicious of anybody they didn't know. They had over 6,900 leads that were called into the task force investigators, resulting in something like 4,700 police reports. They had an enormous number of people to move through, which slowed down the investigation.
If they'd watch prom night, they'd save time. There's a formula to it. A very simple formula. Everybody's a suspect.
The first suspect in Scream is a student, and the boyfriend of the movie is heroin. In the real story, the finger was pointed at a 19-year-old student who attended the University of Florida. He was reported as behaving erratically, ranting about the murders in town, and he had a history of violence. The police had identified a prime suspect in Scream. The first suspect is quickly arrested. But when the killing spree continues, the police release him. In contrast, in Gainesville, after the arrest of a 19-year-old student, the murders stopped, and the police were convinced they had their man. Following reports of his erratic behavior and an alleged assault on his grandmother, the 19-year-old was taken into custody. He was interrogated for 24 hours without a solicitor. Also, in a moment where he lost it, he had been in a car and jumped out while the car was moving, and his face was scarred on one side. The scarred student was formally charged with the attack on his grandmother and put behind bars. Bail was set at an unprecedented $1 million. Investigators now had to find a link between the 19-year-old and the murder scenes. Initial tests on the semen found at one of the crime scenes gave them their first real lead, but a full DNA analysis would take several weeks. But the sample did reveal that whoever had left it had a rare blood type, and it turned out to be a type D secretor. The man the police were holding as their prime suspect didn't have type B blood, but they couldn't eliminate him totally from whether he was there or not. He just did not contribute the biological fluid on the paper towels. The 19-year-old was a schizophrenic who had stopped taking his medication and behaved aggressively in public. Despite the lack of hard evidence linking him to the murder scenes, the 19-year-old student was kept behind bars for 22 months on a minor assault charge. While investigators focused their efforts on a scarred man, the real killer was still at large. On the day the third victim, Krista Hoyt, was discovered, a bank in Gainesville was robbed at gunpoint. The day after, beat officers spotted the robber walking down a street in Gainesville. They pursued him into the dense woodland surrounding the town, but lost him. Instead, they stumbled upon what appeared to be his campsite. The campsite had some dye-stained money. They deducted that it was related to the armed robbery of the bank, but what they didn't know was he was also the serial killer they were hunting. The campsite would turn out to contain key forensic evidence leading to his identification. At the time, officers had no idea of the significance of the find. They thought they found the campsite the bank robber. The officers bagged the contents of the campsite for later analysis: a gun, a ski mask, a screwdriver, a roll of duct tape, and a cassette tape recorder. So the key evidence then ended up in storage. The big piece in the jigsaw puzzle fell into place 14 months after the killing spree in Gainesville. In response to a nationwide request from the Gainesville Task Force for reports of similar crimes, authorities flagged a triple homicide over 1,000 kilometers away in Shreveport. Several in a homicide task force got together and traveled to Shreveport to actually visit the crime scene, further trying to establish a link between their crime scenes. A year before the Gainesville killings, 24-year-old Julie Grissom was brutally murdered and raped in her apartment. Her 8-year-old nephew and father were also killed in the attack. It wasn't just the method of the murder. There was also another striking similarity between the crimes. Once the link between the Shreveport murders and the student homicides had been found, the Gainesville Task Force widened the search. The police began to re-examine every crime that took place in the town around the week of the killings. It wasn't long before the items bagged at the bank robber's campsite were pulled from police storage and placed under the microscope. The screwdriver would match perfectly with prime marks at 2 crime scenes. They also had the duct tape, which had been used at 2 crime scenes. In addition to the screwdriver and duct tape, they discovered a strand of hair belonging to Krista Hoyt, and forensic analysis of a pair of trousers recovered from the campsite revealed traces of Manuel Tabaudi's blood. The evidence finally revealed the horrific truth. The owner of the campsite and the serial killer were one and the same person. The investigators still had no idea who that person was until they listened to the cassette tape.
But this is not the road that I really wanted. This is not what I wanted. This man, Danny Harold Rowling.
Danny Harold Rowling had identified himself on tape. On the night of the first murders, he had made recordings for his own entertainment, a collection of thoughts, songs, and messages to his family. When Rowling was identified as a principal suspect, it enabled the investigators to free up human resources dramatically. The search for Rowling revealed he was already behind bars. He had been arrested for armed robbery the week after the Gainesville murders and detained in Marion County Jail. Rowling wouldn't admit to killing the 5 students, so investigators had to rely on good old-fashioned police work. to prove he was guilty of the murders beyond a reasonable doubt. The final showdown. At the end of Scream sees Ghostface is unmasked, and a twist reveals there are two murderers. They are caught and killed after admitting they committed the crimes. The real story wasn't as simple. 3,000 key pieces of evidence were being processed. DNA samples were taken from Rolling and compared to the sample found at the first crime scene. It was all a perfect match. Once the DNA results began to come in, and they had the results, the forensic gold mine from the campsite that was recovered where he had robbed a bank. Those two combinations made the case against Rolling. Now convinced Rolling was responsible for all 5 murders, despite his innocent plea, the prosecution felt confident. They were on track for a guilty verdict. A month before the trial, the prosecution received an unexpected phone call. Danny Rolling wanted to talk to Len Register, the state attorney. Rolling knew there was an overwhelming amount of evidence against him and wanted to talk, but it wouldn't be a straight interview. In a bizarre twist, Rolling wanted to use his cellmate, Bobby Lewis, as his spokesperson. State Attorney Rod Smith sent Officer Legrand Hewitt to conduct the interview, but with specific instructions. He was to take a camera and set it up like he's on a movie camera. Nobody ever loved to see himself perform more than Danny did. A few minutes into it, Legrand, he just looks over Danny, and he said, "Is that right, Danny? Is that correct?" Yes, okay. And now they had him dead to the right. They had him on tape, telling exactly how he did it, in ways that nobody else could have known. Rowling's filmed confession was the final nail in his coffin. In an ironic twist, Rowling, whose own brutal actions inspired Scream, had been inspired himself by a horror movie. Danny had a couple of personas that he gave himself. One was Enid, which is Danny spelt backwards, which he had gotten from a movie called The Exorcist Part 3. Also named himself Gemini, which was the name of the killer in the movie. Rowling claimed he was possessed by a demon. No one believed him. The movie was released in 1990, just 1 week before the Gainesville student murders. On April 20th, 1994, Danny Harold Rolling was sentenced to death by lethal injection for the brutal and sickening murders of Sonia Larson, Christina Powell, Krista Hoyt, Tracy Paules, and Manuel Tobaud. He was executed 12 years later on October 25, 2006. DNA evidence would also link him to the murder of the Grissom family in Shreveport, Louisiana. Wes Craven's Scream provided one of the most iconic and frightening villains in movie history, but the real serial killer that inspired the story was far more terrifying. The shadow cast over this town by a masked serial killer had finally ended. I really hope you enjoyed that story, little ones. Now it's time to close your eyes and go to sleep and try not to get murdered before you wake. For more bedtime murder stories, like and subscribe.